Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Washington Post Intelligence Weekly Briefing. Every Friday, we bring together our analysts and thought leaders across sectors for a single purpose: to get smarter faster. I'm Louisa Savage, Editorial Director of Washington Post Intelligence, and if this is your first time joining us, WP Intelligence is a new kind of media. It's built for executives and decision makers who need insight to help them see around the corners of what's coming in policy and industry trends. Our subscribers receive concise intelligence reports with actionable recommendations across AI and tech, energy and climate, global security, and coming on Monday, healthcare. We get a graphics library, exclusive interviews, and these live briefings where we sort out developments that are changing the business, policy, and technology landscape. And today, we're looking at critical minerals. These are the building blocks of the technologies and the industries that are reshaping our world. And we're going to talk about how China is wielding rare earth diplomacy against the United States and how Washington and its allies are racing to respond. We're going to discuss both the state of U.S. China relations over rare earths and critical minerals and the effort here to start producing more of these critical minerals in the United States. And to unpack this very high stakes topics, we are joined by several expert guests. Josh Rogin is our lead global security analyst, and he's been tracking the back and forth with Beijing over export controls of various sorts, including over critical minerals. Welcome, Josh. And Kathryn Clay is our lead energy and environment analyst, and she's been doing a series of in-depth reports on the supply and demand situations for critical minerals and what it would take to create alternative supply chains in the US and with allies. Welcome, Kathryn.
Good morning.
And today we have a special guest, Commissioner Leland Miller of the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission, which just this week submitted its annual report to Congress, and it had a lot to say about critical minerals. Welcome, Leland.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for being here, and here's how we'll organize our conversation for the next hour. First, we're going to talk about China's dominance of the supply chain and how they've been wielding this power in trade negotiations. Second, we'll talk about how the US is responding, both diplomatically and also industrially. And third, we'll discuss what lies ahead in terms of supply chain gaps and the implications for industry. And as always, we'll discuss how business leaders and policymakers should navigate this moment of uncertainty. So I'd like to thank our audience for the large number of truly excellent questions that you sent in ahead of the briefing. We've used them to help shape this conversation. And throughout the hour, I invite you to drop your questions and comments into the chat, and we'll take relevant questions as we go along. So let's get to it. Josh, you wrote a report, and I love the title, Rare Earths, Real Leverage, China's Mineral Strategy Bites, which I think is a great, succinct summary of the situation. I thought your statistics were just astonishing. You wrote that China controls roughly 70% of rare earth mining, 90% of processing and separation, and 93% of magnet manufacturing. So give us the story here. How did China come to be in such a dominant position?
Right. Well, thanks, Louisa. Of course, it was you who wrote that headline, so you deserve the credit on that one.
I didn't remember that.
If we're being honest.
All right.
Don't want to take credit for your headline there, but the way that we got here was that over the course of decades, the Chinese government pursued a long-term strategy of building out the capacity both at home and abroad to dominate and monopolize supply chains for all of the minerals or at least many of the minerals that power the modern technologies that we depend on. And they did that through a mix of massive government subsidies, state-owned enterprises, some corrupt deals in third world countries, some non-corrupt deals in third world countries. And overall, by making China an indispensable or even unilateral a player in many of these mineral supply chains, they essentially developed the leverage to hold the entire world's technology, automotive, and defense industries hostage at any time. They just never used it this aggressively in the past. And what we've seen over the course of 2025 is that the Chinese government has decided to increasingly both threaten and use this leverage, primarily against the United States, but not only against the United States. And that's a huge escalation. Of course, that comes in retaliation, some would say, for the Trump administration's tariff and trade war. But we'll get into that later. But the point is that they spent decades developing these dependencies, our dependencies on them for all of these critical and rare materials. And now they've got us. Now we're stuck. And the things that we're doing to scramble to build our capacity are tactical and ad hoc and too little and too late. And our auto industry and our defense industry and our technology industry are getting squeezed right now. And that's a huge point of leverage for the Chinese, both in the industrial, economic, political, and diplomatic spaces.
You know, it's an incredibly high stakes issue, and I feel like we've been talking about it for some years. Leland, you just had this big report come out. Tell us a little bit about how you're seeing China using this leverage, and what are they doing to secure that leverage?
Well, I think it gets to the very different ways the United States and China have looked at this issue historically. So for the United States, it's been an issue of economics. And for the Chinese, it's been an issue of national security. So what the model for what the Chinese have been doing for years has been they decide what are particular areas where they want to control supply chains, and they start gobbling up market share. Now they do it by acquiring companies and buying things out. But then when there are foreign competitors, which there have been in the United States and elsewhere, they control supply. So because this is a government-backed effort, they're not worried about profits. They can just ramp up the supply, bring the price of any of these minerals down very, very low, and then foreign competitors can't compete on price and they go bankrupt, which means the Chinese can gobble up more market share and then they can raise the prices again. So this is something that we've seen for years and years and years and years. The United States has never gotten the message up until very recently because it was always an issue of economics. It was an issue of making sure that this dirty processing was outsourced somewhere else. And so it was always a matter of, we'll deal with the supply chain ramifications later. We just right now want the cheapest minerals possible. The major development that's happened over the last, say, 6 months has been a realization on the U.S. side that this cannot be an economic issue. That if critical minerals and rare earth magnets are a national security issue, then they have to be treated by the government as a national security issue, which means that you can't have economics dictate the price of these and the Chinese gobbling up market share. What you have to actually do is establish production back home or production with allies and partners, both on the sourcing and the processing side, so that you have this capacity no matter what levers Beijing pulls abroad. And I think this has been the major transformation of the debate from an economic issue to an economic security / national security issue. And that's why the government response has been very different over the course of 2025 than it has the previous decade and a half.
Right. Let's stay on that point for one moment, Leland. We were talking before we came on that this was talked about in the first Trump administration and it was talked about in the Biden administration. What is different now in the second Trump administration that it's really becoming even more elevated as an issue?
I've been focusing on supply chains the last decade plus, and there is no more sleep-inducing word than the term supply chains. In a vacuum, that sounds really, really boring, and policymakers don't want to have anything to do with it. The reason it's different now is that this is not just a supply chain issue. For the Trump administration, this was an issue that interfered with their trade war. And so when tariffs were levied and the U.S. put their leverage on the table, the Chinese response was to say, "Well, wait a second. You're going to do this to us, then we have leverage to pull too." And we just happen to control a bunch of key supply chains that choke points, and we're going to use that leverage to make your economy very, very uncomfortable. The second that this was elevated from some sort of supply chain issue in some sort of existential sense to a trade war, tariff war, 2025 issue that interfered with what the president wanted to do with his foreign policy, I think people in the White House got very, very serious and treated this with a different level of seriousness than they had in the past.
Yeah. So, Josh, help us kind of walk us through what has been going on with the administration and with Beijing. You have this great chart in your report that shows the increasing use of sanctions and restrictions between the U.S. and China. So, maybe you could walk us through and kind of bring us up to speed on where we stand now after President Trump's recent trip to China, where access to critical minerals and rare earths was one of the big topics of discussion.
Right. Well, there's two different issues here. We've got export controls, which are meant to deny China the highest level of U.S. critical technology. And then you've got sanctions, which are meant to punish Chinese companies or the Chinese government or Chinese institutions for unfair trade practices. And then you've got the trade and mineral controls that we were just talking about. So these are all parts of a complicated U.S. China economic relationship that actually there's a lot of continuity between the Biden administration and Trump administration's approach. Both of them basically come from the stance that we're in an economic competition with China. It's strategic. We have to use, carrots and sticks and sanctions and export controls and all of these things in order to manage it right. What's going on most recently is that President Trump has been dismantling a lot of those national security related constraints. He has been allowing companies like NVIDIA to sell more and more advanced semiconductors to China at NVIDIA's request, by the way. And in the latest meeting between him and Xi Jinping in Busan, South Korea in October, he actually reversed a lot of the Commerce Department's new restrictions on what kind of Chinese companies qualify under certain sanctions and export control restrictions. So what we see right now is actually that the team of people inside the administration and inside the U.S. China intellectual community that believe in more cooperation and less competition are winning the day. And those of us, including, I don't want to speak for Leland, but I think most of the people on the U.S. China Economic Security and Review Commission, which released a great report on this week that everyone should check out, by the way, believe that, no, actually, we need more competition and less cooperation. And inside the administration, it's split. And, those two teams are fighting against each other as we speak. And right now, President Trump is siding with the engagement side, the cooperation side, because he wants to deal with his good friend Xi Jinping. And that's undermining, in my view, a lot of the national security related measures that we just put on the screen right now.
Josh, can you sort of map out for us who are the players on this issue in the White House? And you kind of described two different teams. Who's on which team?
Yeah, I don't want to assign too much organization to the Trump administration because it's not organized. It is kind of what it looks like. It's kind of a mess. But the big players are these. So you have Howard Lutnick, our Commerce Secretary, who's basically running the trade negotiations in a lot of countries and going around and helping them strike deals. And a lot of these deals are related to critical minerals, including a recent deal that President Trump struck while he was in Tokyo to jointly develop critical mineral resources, et cetera. Then you have Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who's in charge of the U.S. China negotiations specifically, and his team are the ones trying to negotiate that directly with the Chinese, and they're more on the engagement side. And then, of course, you have inside the White House a guy named David Sachs. He's our AI czar. He's like a Silicon Valley PayPal bro. And he's all for giving all of our technology to the Chinese. Of course, that benefits the tech bro community. And then you've got on the other side more hawkish people like Marco Rubio, and I would add most of Congress and other people in like Senator Jim Banks, who are pushing for actually more national security restrictions. So it's not just two teams. There's a lot of different players. Roughly, some of them are more pro-engagement and some of them are more pro-competition. And then you have President Trump, who sort of lords over this dynamic and meanders from faction to faction with varying levels of intentionality and or awareness.
Leland, in your report to Congress, you wrote that despite the pause in restrictions, you see evidence that China is preparing to be able to use this leverage again in negotiations against the United States, and that this isn't something that's going away. Can you talk about what you're seeing that led the commission to this conclusion?
Well, I'm going to speak in my personal capacity now because I think the commission members have various views on this. But I think that the overarching view is that from Beijing's perspective, they found a winning hand. This
Mm.
is a major supply chain choke point, critical minerals, rare earths. There are other ones they're developing, which we could talk about. But in terms of just using export controls, this is very effective for them because if you're in a trade negotiation, you're only talking about trade. Who has the leverage between the U.S. and China? The United States has overwhelming leverage because it exports, it imports much more. China is the major exporter, weak importer. And so the trade leverage in a trade only negotiation is overwhelming in the United States side. When you start bringing in other things like export controls then and supply chains, then all of a sudden these are things that give China leverage on this. What they've developed is a way of first bilaterally cutting off certain rare earths and other critical minerals to the United States and to other Western countries. But what they really shocked people with, and they shouldn't have, because this has been signaled for a year or two now, is that they were going to create a extraterritorial jurisdiction over some of their supply chains, very similar to what the United States does under the foreign direct product rule, in particular with advanced semiconductors. The idea here is that we're not just going to regulate bilateral trade. So not just something that comes out of China that goes to the United States. Anything that uses even small amounts of Chinese elements, processing, methodologies, IP, et cetera, around the world that has any type of nexus with Chinese production or processing, this falls under their new extraterritorial regime, and they can govern it. Similar to the way the United States has done extraterritorial jurisdiction over semiconductors and some other things. So this is a very powerful new tool. As part of the recent détente, the Chinese agreed to call it off for a certain amount of time. Now, some people say it's a year, some people say it's shorter. The answer is it's shorter because as soon as the United States annoys China on any of this stuff, the Chinese will turn it on. But I don't think that this was a big give for them in the short term because the Chinese program is not ready for prime time. This is a major global compliance regime that it's going to take years to sort of build up into full capacity. So they're very happy to put it on pause right now, and they will trade away the idea. They'll turn it up or down. They'll pause it. They'll never trade it permanently away because I think this is the greatest leverage they have in the U.S.-China competition. They're not going to trade it away. What they're going to do is they're going to build on it. They're going to get better at regulating the compliance over global compliance over rare earths and critical minerals, and then they're going to move on to doing other sectors that they have supply chain choke points on. So this is the beginning of the new stage of U.S.-China competition. I recently wrote an article for the Aspen Security Group called "The U.S.-China Trade War is Dead. Long live the supply chain war." I think that basically says is we're at a high level of tariffs, but one that could be sustainable in the long term. Tariffs are no longer going to dictate the competition between the U.S. and China or the way they interact. It's going to be the handling of supply chains and other things related to that. They're going to dictate U.S.-China competition going forward.
And Josh, I see you nodding. Do you see it this way? And is this going to change the perspective inside the administration that you were just describing as one very focused on trying to reach an agreement, an overall trade agreement?
Yeah, no, I agree with Leland 100%. I would just add a couple of extra things. Like the use of this leverage, although the Chinese haven't done everything that they can, is already well underway. U.S. defense primes haven't received magnets in several months. U.S. automakers are getting a drip of Chinese components such that the Chinese know that all of those automakers are going to call up all of their lawmakers and all of their lobbyists and go to the White House and press President Trump to do this or that, to back off the Chinese so that they can get what they need to survive, to do their bit to make their cars. And that's I think that supply chain war is on. And especially in magnets, also in lithium and in super hard materials and lots of other things. So we're not at maximum hot war over these minerals yet, but it's a medium boil war that's definitely raging and already having a big impact on U.S. manufacturers, allied manufacturers. And I think that's why you do see the White House scrambling. I think it has had a big effect, and they're striking these deals, but these are just deals on paper until these factories get built and the investment and the financing comes through, and then the supply chains for those factories come through, and those supply chains kind of run through China. That's going to take years. So we're already a day late and a dollar short. And then you add sort of the peculiarity of this White House, which every time they make one of these deals, they want a piece for themselves, a piece of equity. And we saw this in a recent deal that the Army made with a company in California called MP Materials to build magnets in California, which is a great idea. Everybody agrees it, but the U.S. government's going to take a piece of the company. And, that kind of is a thing that has all sorts of second and third degree knock-on effects and risks for new businesses. And then they've got to find customers for all these businesses, because no matter what we build, even with Japan or Australia or whatever country, it's going to be a lot more expensive than what the Chinese are doing, because they can do it at scale, and they've got the whole supply chain, and they're subsidizing it with a state-owned totalitarian economy. So who's going to buy the stuff that we build? Well, we have to find the customers. And so there's just so much to do on this. And we're already in such a bad position that I think, the White House has been backed off of a lot of its grandiose plans for the U.S. China trade war. And that doesn't mean that a deal is less or more likely. What it means is that the scope of any deal will be much narrower, in my estimation, because these kinds of structural problems are destined to remain.
Well, you hinted a little bit at what it's going to take for the U.S. to develop these supply chains, and I guess a perfect segue to bring in Kathryn, our energy and climate analyst, who's written a lot about what it's going to take and some of the efforts underway. Kathryn, one of the things I've heard repeatedly about rare earths and critical minerals is that they're not exactly rare per se, right? They're found all over the world. It's more a question of where are they actually being extracted and processed. So give us an overview of what the U.S. endowment looks like and what do we mine and refine here. There's an audience question asking, why do no U.S. sources of critical minerals exist? Don't they exist, or are they just too expensive to extract?
Absolutely, and we've had great audience questions exactly to that point, and I really appreciate the way that Leland and Josh have laid out the immense geopolitical urgency of the issue. And, it is true that rare earth minerals are not particularly rare. They do occur, they're quite common throughout the Earth's crust. But as is the case with most minerals and most things that we mine, the nature of the industry is that you go to the richest deposits first, and those are the most economic, and that as those get depleted, you move on to lesser and lesser endowed portions of the earth for that particular mineral. So that's kind of a common story that you see again and again with any kind of mining or mineral industry. And the case with rare earths is that we just, two things, we don't have the rich deposits that exist in some other parts of the world, such as China. But also, as we've heard earlier in this discussion, it's also about investment and strategic thinking. And the Chinese have done a better job over decades of sustaining investment to make sure that they do have a supply and the ability to export these minerals. And, frankly, we have some resources, but we've taken our eye off the ball and we haven't invested to the same degree. So each story, each of the critical minerals that we list as a nation, I think there are over 60 now, has a slightly different story. I'll take your cue, Louisa, when it's time to talk about the two that I've been looking at in most detail recently. That's lithium and copper.
Yeah, and before we get into those, I had 3 audience questions kind of circling around the same topic. Before we get into specific minerals, but what can be done, broadly speaking, to develop alternate supply chains at home? What is being done? What can the U.S. government do to encourage or speed development of these alternate supply chains? And what other aspects of manufacturing require the same attention and development? So could you speak a little bit? I know we do some mining. Can you give us a sense of how much that is in the grand scheme of things? And what kinds of initiatives are you seeing the government do or could they be doing?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with lithium. So today we only produce about 1% of the world's lithium, and that's out of a single mine in Nevada. But we do have resources in lithium, and the story of what is an economic resource is also something that changes because it's changing with the technology that develops and opens up new possibilities for economic retrieval of those minerals. One of the most exciting stories, and it's not the only lithium resource in the United States, but a very promising and exciting one, lies deep underground Arkansas, Texas, and a little bit of Florida, a little bit of Louisiana as well. But primarily, this is a resource that has some good potential to be developed in Arkansas and Texas, and that's called the Smackover Formation. So the
Yeah,
Smackover
let's
Formation,
show this on
yeah,
screen, Kathryn. You
yeah,
looked at the question of can the U.S. South become a lithium leader in one of your most recent reports?
yes, and so we have a map here of where the Smackover is located. It was traditionally an oil-producing region, and that is at its heart one of the reasons why this is such an exciting story for the United States, because it turns out that the same know-how, the same capital expenditures, the same drilling sites in some parts of the Smackover that were used for oil now have the potential for a second life to be used for lithium production. Now, all of this, it's not in commercial production today. There are some big players like Exxon, Smackover Lithium, Equinor, which is a big Norwegian major, is investing in this part of Arkansas and Texas and development of lithium there. They're all betting on a new technology that's called direct lithium extraction. And those technologies will make it more economic to retrieve the lithium that's dissolved into these very salty brines. It's essentially a water aquifer with a lot of different mineral components dissolved into it. And one of those mineral constituents is lithium. So using and this direct lithium extraction is, if it is successful, a way of kind of leapfrogging what actually is the world leader today, and that's the picture that you just saw briefly on the screen. These very beautiful multicolored turquoise and azure pools are what's called a salar. These are found in the so-called lithium triangle in South America, which comprises parts of Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. And there's also a very rich saline brine that contains lithium, although at 100 or 1,000 times the percentages of lithium that we have in the Smackover. So that's the heart of the lithium industry today, in that lithium triangle in South America. Those beautiful pools in that image rely solely on the sun. So they will be, the saline will be pumped up, it will be left in those pools for 18 months to 2 years until it evaporates from direct solar energy. So it's essentially a free energy input. And that makes it very hard to compete with the South American lithium. If these technologies come to pass and live up to their promise, these direct lithium extraction technologies, there's a potential for the U.S. to be a major player in lithium. And again, it's not the only resource we have. There's some hard rock lithium possibilities, some clay mining lithium. But in terms of just the scale of the potential resource, the Smackover is a very exciting place to look.
So we have an audience question asking, how far along are the companies exploring mining and lithium deposits in the Smackover Formation? And a lot of questions about timelines. So can you give us a sense of, is this sort of pie in the sky 10 years down the road? Is it happening now? And what are those states doing to either support or not support this development?
Yeah, those are great questions. Well, according to the company's public announcements, we are not very far away at all. The companies that I mentioned, Exxon and Standard Lithium, are talking about commercial production in the timeframe of perhaps 2027, 2028. So early days, and those technologies, we still have to see if those production timelines are met. But we are not talking about decades in the future. There are about 60 companies that are in this direct lithium extraction technology space, a lot of competition, a lot of innovation, and to the points we've heard earlier about the need for our government to step in. It's not just about the private sector anymore. These are strategic international issues, and we need government engagement. The Trump administration is continuing some support that had occurred initially in the Biden administration, some DOE grants to help and support the extraction of the Smackover lithium. And again, the Trump administration has renegotiated some of those deals, including taking a government stake of about 10% in one of them. So it's a different kind of approach than we saw under Biden, but the Trump administration is trying to speed up those timelines, bring these projects to fruition a little more quickly by supporting them with large government investments and making that a priority.
Mm-hmm. Leland, we have a couple questions, and one of them sort of keys off of what you said earlier about price controls and price manipulations and dumping. China has been destroying competition through dumping over the past 30 years. 15 years ago, we started working on fixing that. How did we drop the ball, and how do we ensure that it doesn't happen again? I mean, is this a multilateral effort? Is this a bilateral negotiation? How do you address that economic quandary that you so well described earlier?
Well, we have dropped the ball on it. All these things are multilateral. You can't do anything in a vacuum. It's going to have to be with allies and partners, because if you're de-risking from Chinese supply chains, you have to build other supply chains. You want to bring some manufacturing back here, some production back here, but you can't bring everything back. You got to be realistic about this. And so, yes, this is something done with allies and partners. But for all the talk about dumping being an issue the U.S. has pushed back on for years, that's been true at the margins. It's not true in core, in core sectors that we're looking at right now. The reality is that it goes back to the original comment that I made in the introduction here. This has been looked at as an economics issue. And so we've tried to use trade tools and others to tweak China's behavior at the margins. But when you're judging these national security priorities as economic questions, you're always going to have a profitability question at the end of the day. And if the Chinese control the levers for, ramp up the supply, which means prices are being driven down, which means U.S. companies and other Western companies become unprofitable, you're never going to be able to do what you need to do. So I think that the big leap that has been made right now, by people in Congress, by the current administration and others, is to say there are some things, regardless of our fealty to free market economy, to free market economics, and to open trade, there are certain things in which the government has to play a role, and the government has to play a role because these are not just economic issues; they're national security issues. When we start looking at things broader than critical rare earths and critical minerals, start looking at things like pharmaceuticals and others, there are real life and death questions being decided by whether China can control the supply chain of pharmaceuticals, for instance, coming to this country. So if you start looking at these things as national security interests and not as economic only interests, then you address the solution is different. And you usually have to have something in which it's not a bottom line thing. It's that if you need production in the United States or you need it in allied countries, because you can't let it all be produced in another country, particularly an adversary, then you have to prioritize it differently. The government has to take a more significant role, and the most obvious way to do that is through price floors. To say we don't care what the economics are in the industry because Beijing and the market at large can control the ups and downs of prices. We don't want our stake, our interest, our ability to produce to be based on the fluctuations of the market. If it's a national security interest, then it has to be governed by national security principles. So again, putting a price floor then eliminates the economics of the issue and says these companies are going to be profitable at some level, no matter what happens to the exact prices of the minerals over at any particular spot in time, because the government is going to end up backstopping these investments. I think that is the big change that we're seeing right now, and it's an important one, and it needs to be applied not just within the critical mineral space, but also to other areas that have a national security nexus.
Leland, there's an audience question asking, how is this the same or different from OPEC's world petroleum market control in the 1970s in terms of U.S. public perception of the problem, and I guess what the U.S. can do about it? Do you see parallels there? Or is this very different?
Well, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the analogy. I will say that if you look at it's about a foreign government or a foreign oligopoly controlling national security issues in your country. So from that perspective, there certainly are similarities. The way that we push back on that is by saying most of these countries are sort of our allies. We can push back through other mechanisms. It was never comfortable along the way, but this was an issue. And what did the United States do? It start developing its own resources more aggressively, and now we don't have the same stranglehold that OPEC had years ago. We have to have the same approach here with critical minerals and other issues. You cannot let another country, particularly a significant competitor or adversary, have a choke point on a supply chain that you deem critical for national security. And if it sounds like I'm repeating myself, I certainly am, because the major takeaway that people should have from this is we're moving from an era in which everything was seen as sort of an economic issue to saying there are certain issues that are economic security and therefore national security issues, and we have to look at it through a very different lens.
Well, Kathryn, both Josh and Leland have been saying it's not just economic, it's national security. But the other pressure here, obviously, is environmental. And we have a couple of questions on that. Would cleaner extraction and refining technology help the position of the U.S.? And someone else saying, historically, it has been cheaper and better for the U.S. to let China handle the often dangerous and environmentally destructive mining and processing of rare earth minerals. How well do you anticipate the environmental impacts and labor conditions related to U.S. mineral production? How will they be embraced by the U.S. populations? How much will state and local restrictions hamper these efforts? So could you speak maybe to the environmental piece here?
Yes, absolutely. And again, great questions from the audience. I think that, in fact, those questions all come back to why the Smackover Formation is so exciting. So again, there are very credible resources in other parts of the country that are hard rock, lithium mining or clay-based mining. But a report by the Nature Conservancy in 2022 looked at exactly this issue and looked at what the environmental impacts were of the different kinds of lithium resources and the different kinds of extraction. And what that report concluded was that the environmental, all extraction methods have some environmental consequence. The most benign of all of the choices was direct lithium extraction for the brines that are in the Smackover Formation. And part of that is because the whole area that we're talking about developing is essentially a brownfield site already. This is an area that was used decades ago for oil production. It was also used for the bromine industry in Arkansas. So that's part of what the Smackover Formation has going for it. The other thing it has going for it is that just the new technologies and using the brine rather than processing tons and tons of rocky ore, or using the huge salar pools, those beautiful blue pools that you saw in the earlier image, those have more environmental impacts because they use a lot more water. They're taking more water from aquifers, from farming, from local communities. So the bottom line, and the reason that I chose to focus on the Smackover Formation is, again, because the environmental pendulum kind of pushes us in that direction, that might be the future. I want to say a little bit about copper, and in that, we haven't talked much about copper yet.
I want to bring that in a minute, but can I just ask you one more question on lithium before we move on, because we have a good audience question.
Sure.
Focusing on EV and grid batteries, do any near future technologies, are there any that are not so dependent on lithium or other minerals that China largely controls?
Yes, the questioner is asking something that is quite dear to my heart. My PhD was in battery technology, so I have a lot more than we have time for. I'll just say this. I'll say that lithium has a superpower, and that is packing a tremendous amount of energy in a very, very low weight. If you're talking about a mobile technology like an electric vehicle or the portable electronics that we all rely on and carry around with us every day, lithium is really going to be hard to beat. And there are a lot of reasons why we should be conserving our lithium for its highest and best uses. Increasingly, though, we're using lithium for grid scale storage, and not saying it's a bad idea. There are economic reasons why it's happening, but from a strategic perspective as a country, there's no reason to use lithium for technology that's going to sit in one place for 20 or 30 years. That just isn't using its superpower. There are a lot of other technologies that are like flow batteries, vanadium-based batteries, some of the sodium-based batteries that would be very credible competitors to lithium in a stationary situation. But we probably need to take some policy moves to encourage them because lithium has taken over so much of that market.
That is fascinating. So much more to unpack there. We'll have to do another discussion just on lithium. But we did want to get to copper because you had another great report with another great headline, if I don't say so myself, on the coming copper crisis, which when you were telling me about it initially, you said, I've been talking to all these business leaders that rely on copper and they don't realize about the copper crisis that's coming. So tell us what's going on.
Yes, and thank you, Louisa, for giving me such a great topic or a great title. So thank you for that. The story with lithium, or I'm sorry, with copper is this is something that's a very, very well-known story. Everyone in the copper industry and the mining community knows this is happening. But if you are, say, an electric utility executive and you talk to your supplier for copper wire and they say, yeah, we're good, we're solid, it's not your supplier that is seeing down the road that there are going to be some volatility issues, that there are going to be some shortages. It's your supplier who is scrambling and thinking about 10, 15 years from now, where am I going to get the copper? Again, this goes back to what we touched on earlier, that as a mineral is utilized, we use the richest seams first, and then we have to move down grade and use less and less intense sources of that mineral. So what that means is you've got to process a lot more of the ore, those massive quantities of rock.
Yeah, we have
You've
a
got to
great picture
process.
of the rocks too. Can we show
Yeah.
that?
Oh, let's look at let's look at
Yeah,
that because I think
we
that
love all the
is
beautiful
helpful.
sciencey pictures. Yeah, so you were
Yeah.
saying that you have to process the rock.
Yes. Yeah, so these are some samples actually taken from a mine site in Alaska that is being evaluated for commercial use. And that beautiful green color you see in these samples, that's the copper content. And historically, when we first started mining copper back in the 1700s, the rocky ore that was pulled out of the ground in Cornwall, England, was able to yield about 12% of that stone would end up being copper. In 1990, that number had fallen to about 1.2%. So for every ton of that rocky ore, only about 1.2% of a ton was copper after it was processed. Today, 35 years later, it's 0.65% is the global average. So that trend is going to continue while our demand for copper is going up, driven a lot by the need to build out new electrical grids here at home, but also in the developing world. And the copper needs are much greater for clean tech. So solar, wind, electric vehicles, they're just really copper hungry. In fact, an electric vehicle takes about 4 times the amount of copper that a standard gasoline vehicle would take. So the world needs more copper. The grade of copper, that richness of the mineral, is becoming less and less rich. And what that means is not that we're going to run out of copper, but that we have to mine a lot more ore to get the same amount or to get the incremental growth that we need. So we need to be talking about investment in copper mines. It used to be a few $100 million to maybe $1 billion to invest in developing a new copper mine. Now we're talking about tens of billions of dollars to invest in bringing one new mine on because of the scale that it's going to require to provide the copper that we need. So one of my experts put it as, we're not running out of copper, but we're potentially running out of the appetite for risk. And that's where we need to put our attention.
That's fascinating. And you had a chart there, just to close the loop, showing China's role in the copper supply chain as well.
Yes, and this really speaks to the foresight that both Josh and Leland have spoken to in this conversation, that China has brought this foresight into thinking about what is the world going to need and how can we play a controlling role. So China has been on a bit of a building spree when it comes to copper refining and copper smelting. So they, just over the last few years, have taken this enormous leadership role, this phenomenal lead over the rest of the world, because they see that this demand crunch is coming and they see the strategic role that they can play. Going back to the environmental question, can we compete with China in the speed at which they throw up new copper smelters and copper refining on the order of perhaps 8 or 9 months for a copper smelter? Absolutely not. But do we need to do better than the 25 to 30 years on average that it takes for us to build a new mine or a new smelter because of the permitting challenges? We absolutely have to do better than that if we're going to maintain a strategic place in the world.
And Kathryn, last question on this topic. We have an audience member asking about recycling. Can that be a potential solution here?
I am much more bullish about recycling in the world of copper than I am in lithium. So let me talk a little bit about that. Copper has a long history of recycling and what they call thrifting, which is designing products that use copper to be using only the bare minimum that needs to be copper and using substitution of other materials around it. So it could be using fiber optics instead of copper cables for some connections between computers and a data center. It could be using aluminum clad wires that are clad in copper for some high power electronics. So between recycling and thrifting, we can stretch our copper supply quite a bit. And those, of course, have environmental benefits. Ultimately, there is a limit. There are some applications that absolutely have to be copper, and some of them need to be what they call virgin copper, so copper that has not been recycled. So the answer to the question is yes, we can do a lot, but it ultimately cannot prevent the need for a massive build out in new mining.
Okay. Josh, we have about 4 audience questions, all circling around the same topic, which is allies. Is the U.S. aligning with other countries, Australia, Chile, et cetera, to develop alternate supply chains? How does Canada and the rest of the world fit into this picture? How critical is Greenland to the rare earth elements of the United States? And is the U.S. aligning, again, another question on Australia and Chile. So what are we doing there?
Right. Well, I think in President Trump's recent trip to Asia, you saw a flurry of activities designed around friendshoring critical mineral and rare earth supply chains, including deals signed in Malaysia, Japan, and with Australia. And at the same time, you saw the Trump administration finalizing, or not finalizing, I should say, at least agreeing to, in principle, trade resolutions with those same countries. And so that kind of tells you what's going on here, is that, the big problem with our friendshoring and ally strategy, of course, is that the Trump administration is waging a trade war against our allies too. In fact, every country in the world at the same time. And if you're any one of those countries, you would have to be thinking, how do I de-risk from the United States? Because Trump has weaponized our trade relationship to shake down countries in every region for things like airplanes or cryptocurrency investments or promises of trillions of dollars of investment in the United States that probably never materialize, or golden crowns, or what have you. So the administration is doing a lot with allies, but they're also threatening allies and threatening to ruin allied economies. And of course, in democracies, that turns the local population against us and against the idea of placing their national security and economic security in our basket. And many of them are likely to see the Chinese as a more pragmatic and, in fact, reliable partner, whether we in Washington agree with that or not. That's what people in the region are telling me. And now when it comes to Canada, yes, we're still in a trade war with Canada. So it's really tough to advance that kind of cooperation in that kind of environment. And same thing with Greenland. There's a lot of interesting ideas for how to expand U.S. cooperation with Greenland. It's tough to do when you're threatening to invade them. They don't like that. And that kind of sours the whole kind of mood, when it comes to doing these kinds of things. So, there's a lot going on, but it's just not going as well as it could because the Trump administration's economic and trade policy is to shoot at everyone at the same exact time. And that has its own consequences.
Josh, I want to move to our recommendations. You had some recommendations for executives in your reports. Can you kind of give us a taste?
Sure. Let's see. So, let's see. So, there will be a lot of bottlenecks. And the bottlenecks are really where the investments will go first. And we saw that with the magnets. We saw that with some of the other elements that really started to hamper U.S. industry, especially automakers and defense primes. And politically speaking, you can be sure that the squeakiest wheels will get the grease and the ones with the biggest lobby. So if you focus on those bottlenecks, you should be ahead of the game. Secondly, recycling. What I hear from corporations that are really in the know is that they are scrounging. They're going to places you never thought you would go to find these things and come up with ways of scrapping and getting old machines and old technologies and old chips and figuring out ways to build a factory to take the old stuff and extract whatever you can. And that has its own costs and its own up ramps, but that's going to be a thing forever because these shortages are going to be a thing forever. So that whole recycling and scrapping, scrounging industry is going to be a huge thing. Think about that. And then, the other thing is just sort of like one thing I always say about the Trump administration's trade and economic policies, if you don't like it, wait 15 minutes. It's kind of like the weather in Florida, so you have to think in your planning that whatever you think the regime is for compliance and for vetting and for enforcement, it's going to change, and then it's going to change again. So you have to plan a lot of these different scenarios with the understanding that the Trump administration is going to go back and forth, and they're going to release export controls, and then they're going to undermine them. So you have to be ready to comply with them, but then understand that they could go away in any second. That kind of volatility is systemic now. It's just the way that the Trump administration works, and it's not going to get better. There's no calm coming. There's no settlement. It's going to be like this, chaotic, for at least the next 3 years.
Scenario planning, in other words, would be a good way to spend some time. It sounds like planning out the different scenarios that could potentially happen from a policy perspective is my takeaway from what I'm hearing. Kathryn, your reports also had some recommendations.
Yes, and they're very different for lithium and for copper. And I should mention, I've been speaking about copper as a strategic or a critical material, and that's a very new status that was just assigned by USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, just on November 7th. So every critical mineral, every critical material is going to have a slightly different story. So I think the first advice to business leaders is, don't lump them together. You have to be granular. You have to think about what your particular needs are within that basket of critical materials. For copper, there are some very near-term things that business leaders can start doing to de-risk their enterprises. So we've talked about substitution and thrifting. So again, fiber optics or plastics in some cases, or aluminum, especially aluminum in combination with a small amount of copper, can also provide the benefits that in many uses are adequate. You don't absolutely need copper for some things. For some things, you absolutely do need copper. And for people that are in that situation, you need to be thinking about business risk, because copper prices are almost certainly going to become much more volatile in the coming years, and that's not very far away. This is a year in 2025 where year over year compared to last year, copper supply has actually gone down. Some of that is because there were some really terrible mining incidents that disrupted supply, but a lot of it is structural. So in the copper space, trying to reduce your dependence on copper and trying to just prepare for that volatility. For lithium, it's quite different. I think that many people are looking at lithium because they are looking at battery technologies, that they might be industries that rely on battery technologies. Lithium, we are on the verge of developing the Smackover, but it's going to take a long time for that to ramp up to be at really global scale. And so, again, we're looking at volatility for lithium prices. If we can diversify the batteries that we use, but that's going to take a lot of effort, policy, and investment. But being ready for the coming volatility in both of those markets is a key aspect.
Yeah, and Leland, your commission report had a number of recommendations for Congress. Do you want to highlight any for us today?
Well, it'll be hard to do in 5 minutes. I probably need 5 hours. But I mean, I think that it's worth going over to U.S. China the Commission website, uscc.gov, taking a look. There's a Bible we put out that's a whole bunch of material that's only for the intrepid soul can push through that. But there's an executive summary. There are recent breakouts we've done on export control evasion and on a quantum primer. There's a list of key recommendations that we focus in on that are overwhelmingly focused on technology controls, on supply chains. So they're worth checking out. I think the way that we look at it from the Commission's perspective is we're not trying to work on the issues that everybody else is on the Hill. We're trying to look 3-5 years down the road and prepare Congress for what's coming. And so most of these things are related to issues that are not going to be talked about today or tomorrow. They're going to be talked about in 2, 3, 5 years, and we're trying to get Congress prepped for that. So if that's something that's of interest, then by all means go out, check out the report, and I think you'll find some interesting materials there.
Absolutely. And Josh, we're going to look ahead very briefly. What are you working on next for our subscribers?
Right. Well, there's a big fight in Congress and with the White House over something called the GAIN AI Act. This is meant to legislate export controls on AI technology to any adversarial country, but it really means China. And there's some people on the side of the White House who are trying to kill that bill for their own ideological and financial interests. And we're going to get into it. Stay tuned.
Sounds good. And Kathryn, what are you up to?
Yes, I'm looking at the wrap up of the UN climate talks that are underway at the moment in Belém in the Amazon in Brazil. There have been some interesting outcomes from those conversations among diplomats looking at climate finance and how the developing world can potentially benefit from investment from industrialized countries for forestation and for responding to extreme weather events. So look at how real that is and whether there are opportunities for businesses to actually be part of the change and get some of the business that those funds will support.
Excellent. And Leland, your report is out. So what's next for you?
Well, my day job is I run a company called China Beige Book, so we're watching China's economy and we're advising CEOs and boards on where U.S. China relations are going. On the commission side, on to the next chapter. So we're moving into the 2026 cycle, and we're going to start a series of hearings where we're going to be going at the next issues of tomorrow. And these are all available to sit in on or watch on your computer, and I think they can educate people because we're dealing with different types of issues than people see every day.
Well, I'm curious, and one you had mentioned earlier was pharmaceuticals.
Well, look, one of our recommendations this year was about the next iteration of this supply chain war that I've been referring to. As big an issue as critical minerals are and rare earth magnets are in terms of Beijing's supply chain choke point, pharmaceuticals is far more scary. You have Beijing's control of the pharmaceutical pipeline, and what is the extent? What are the vulnerabilities? We don't know because we don't have the data to understand the extent of the vulnerability. We do know that Beijing controls a lot of the direct shipments of generics to the United States, but far more worrisome, they control the buildup of all these active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into the drugs. And even scarier still, behind the curtain, the key starting materials that are the foundational inputs to the APIs, they also control those. So even when you have drugs coming from India or APIs coming from India, most of the starting materials for those drugs came from China. But if you ask me to what degree, what's the range, what's the extent of the vulnerability, we don't know. And even our staff, researching for months, looking for all the data in the world, could not find that. So one of our key recommendations to Congress was There's lots of things we need to do on supply chains. There are lots of specific things we need to do on pharmaceutical supply chains. But by golly, the first thing we need to do is empower the U.S. government to collect the data so we understand the extent of the vulnerability in terms of supply chains for pharma and for other things like printed circuit boards, foundational semiconductors, et cetera. Supply chains need to be issue number one going forward, and we need the data in order to figure that out.
Excellent. And we'll absolutely have to have you back to talk about pharmaceuticals. We are launching our WP Intelligence healthcare vertical on Monday, so we'll have plenty of opportunity to dive into that. And particularly, I think, connecting the dots between the security and trade conversation and the healthcare conversation will be really interesting. Thank you so much to all three of you, Kathryn, Josh, and Leland. You've really just helped us wrap our arms around a big complex topic. It was absolutely fascinating to talk with you, and we'll continue to cover this issue very closely. I'd like to remind our live audience that you can request a WP Intelligence platform demo by clicking on the link on your screen. And please book your calendar for Fridays at 11 Eastern. It's our regular intelligence briefing slot, although next week we're off for Thanksgiving, but we will be back on Friday, December 5th, and we'll be talking about AI and cybersecurity. In the meantime, we'll send our live audience a link to a recording of the briefing. And please take a moment to fill out the short post-briefing survey that we send you. Your input shapes what comes next. So have a wonderful weekend, happy Thanksgiving holiday, and we'll see you on December 5th.